It's July 19th, 2026, and the fifth month of a war that most people in the West still can't quite believe is actually happening is grinding into a new and uglier phase. Let's get you caught up, because the pace of this thing has been relentless, and it's easy to lose the thread between the strikes, the blockade, the ballistic missiles, and the sideshows happening everywhere from the Mojave Desert to the coast of Cuba. Start with how we got here, because the last few days only make sense with the full arc behind them. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a joint surprise campaign against Iran, hitting military, government, and infrastructure targets in a single coordinated night. And in the middle of that opening strike, Iran's supreme leader was killed along with a string of senior officials. That is not a small detail. Killing the man who had sat at the top of the Iranian system for over 3 decades didn't end the war. It fractured the chain of command underneath him, and a lot of what we're watching play out in the streets and the state media right now is the fallout from that fracture. Iran answered by trying to shut the world's most important oil choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, mining it, boarding ships, and firing on tankers that tried to pass. About a quarter of the planet's seaborne oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas moves through that stretch of water. So closing it wasn't just a regional problem, it became everyone's problem within about a week, and you could watch it show up directly in the price you paid at the pump. The US answered the closure with its own campaign to force the strait back open, and by mid-April had layered a full naval blockade on top of that, intercepting Iranian shipping, seizing vessels, and by the Pentagon's own numbers, squeezing something like $500 million a day out of the Iranian economy. There was a pause. Diplomats got both sides to a memorandum of understanding in the middle of June. Strikes stopped, tankers started moving again, and for a few weeks, it genuinely looked like the thing might be winding down. It wasn't. The ceasefire collapsed in the first week of July, the president declared it over, and by July 10th, Washington had notified Congress that military action was resuming, a notification that also had the effect, in the administration's reading, of resetting the clock Congress uses to eventually require a vote on continued operations. The bombing restarted the next night. It hasn't stopped since, so that brings us to now, and now is intense. Over the last several days, CENTCOM has run consecutive nights of strikes, and if you've watched any of the released footage, you've seen the pattern, because it is a pattern, not a random pile of explosions. The first targets in any strike package tend to be command and control, the communications towers, the relay stations, the nodes that let Iranian commanders actually talk to their forces and coordinate a response. Take that down first, and everything downstream of it gets slower and dumber. After that, you start seeing the logistics targets, the storage facilities, the maritime staging areas the fast attack boats use, and now, in just the last few days, the target list has expanded into things that would have been politically untouchable a few months ago. Bridges, control towers, port infrastructure at places like Chabahar and Bandar Abbas. One of the biggest single detonations of the whole campaign happened this week. An explosion large enough that analysts who study this stuff for a living think it was a ballistic missile storage site going up, propellant included, which is the kind of secondary explosion that tells you the initial strike found exactly what it was aiming for. None of this is one-directional. Iran has kept firing back, and the numbers involved are genuinely wild if you sit with them. In one recent barrage, Iranian forces reportedly launched over 100 missiles at a single U.S. carrier group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and by American accounts, every one of them was intercepted. That tells you two contradictory things at once. It tells you American and Allied air defense in the Gulf right now is performing about as well as it possibly could. And it also tells you Iran still has a stockpile large enough to throw over 100 missiles at a single target and not run out. Some of what they're launching is getting through elsewhere, though, with strikes and intercepted missiles reported over Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Bahrain in just the past week, including a reported hit near an oil facility close to a U.S. base in Kuwait, and intercepted ballistic missiles over Jordanian airspace. The IRGC has also directly targeted a base in Jordan in what it called retaliation. This is a regional war now, in every sense, except the label. It's worth sitting for a moment on what a naval blockade actually does to a country day to day, because the term gets thrown around a lot without people picturing the mechanics. CENTCOM's own accounting from the first phase of the blockade, the roughly 6 weeks it ran before the June pause, claims it redirected over 140 ships away from Iranian ports and physically disabled 9 more that tried to run it anyway. Independent shipping trackers put the number of vessels that managed to slip through anyway at around 24, which tells you the blockade wasn't airtight, no blockade ever is, but it was tight enough to functionally cut off the predictable flow of trade Iran's economy depends on. Insurance premiums for any ship willing to even attempt the strait spiked to levels that made the trip barely worth it commercially. Oil that isn't moving is oil that isn't earning. And for a government whose entire modern survival strategy has depended on oil revenue funding everything from fuel subsidies to the weapons programs we just talked about, $500 million a day in lost revenue isn't a rounding error. It's an amount that starts forcing real choices between paying soldiers, paying subsidies, and paying for the next round of missiles. You can see that squeeze show up in world oil markets too, and not subtly. When the blockade was reimposed in mid-July, Brent crude jumped over 9.5% in a single session. Its biggest one-day percentage gain in more than 6 years, settling above $83 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark, moved almost as sharply. That's the kind of price spike that ripples out to gas stations everywhere, well beyond the Gulf, which is exactly why this war, unlike a lot of regional conflicts, keeps forcing its way back onto the front page, even for people who otherwise have no direct stake in Iranian politics. It's also worth being honest about the human cost here, rather than only talking in terms of hardware and dollar figures, because it's easy for a war covered mostly through strike footage and missile interception statistics to start feeling abstract. Iranian authorities have reported more than 1,500 civilian deaths since the campaign began at the end of February, a figure that obviously comes from a government with every incentive to use it for propaganda purposes. But even discounted heavily for that bias, a 5-month bombing campaign against a country of this size is not a bloodless exercise, and strikes on dual-use infrastructure like bridges, ports, and power plants inevitably touch people who have nothing to do with the IRGC's decision-making. The U.S. side has said repeatedly that it's being careful about civilian population centers, and there's no reason to assume that claim is insincere, but careful and without cost are two very different standards, and it's worth holding both realities in your head at once. The strategic logic driving the target list and the fact that real families are absorbing the consequences of it on the ground. There's an uncomfortable financial backstory to how Iran is still able to do any of this after 5 months of being blockaded and bombed, and it's worth being straight about it rather than glossing over it. Iran spent years building out its ballistic missile and drone stockpiles using a mix of sanctions, evading shadow oil sales, and, going back through multiple administrations, direct cash transfers and unfrozen funds, including a widely reported $1.4 billion cash release under a prior administration that was intended for humanitarian and diplomatic purposes. But that, critics have long argued, freed up other money for weapons programs. You don't have to take a side on the wisdom of any particular past deal to recognize the basic mechanism: money is fungible, and a government that wants to build missiles will always find a way to route freed up cash toward that goal if the alternative uses aren't strictly enforced. It's also why officials who track this closely, including voices from the defense tech industry who've spent years warehousing and building interceptor systems, have argued that time was never on the West side here, because a regime with 10,000 ballistic missiles instead of 1,000 isn't just more dangerous, it changes what's operationally possible for everyone else in the region. At some threshold, you can't safely base forces nearby anymore, and the range problem doesn't stay regional either, it starts to threaten Europe. The politics inside Tehran right now are genuinely murky, and I want to be careful about the difference between what's confirmed and what's speculation, because there's a lot of speculation floating around right now, and not all of it deserves to be treated as fact. What we do know is that Iran's post-assassination leadership is a patchwork. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been the public face of diplomacy, meeting with Omani counterparts and pushing the position that the Strait of Hormuz situation needs to be resolved through talks, at least rhetorically. Meanwhile, the military and paramilitary side, the IRGC, continues operations in the strait that look a lot more like an attempt to bleed the West's patience than an attempt to actually negotiate. Whether that's a genuine internal split between hardliners and a more pragmatic wing, or whether it's a coordinated good cop, bad cop routine designed to keep options open on both tracks at once, is something analysts disagree on, and honestly, nobody outside that inner circle knows for certain. What is true, and worth remembering, is that a lot of Iran's senior political figures, regardless of which faction they're currently associated with, came up through the IRGC's own ranks originally. The line between the regime's diplomats and the regime's military in Iran has always been blurrier than it looks from the outside, and that context matters when you're trying to figure out how sincere any particular olive branch actually is. Iran's information strategy deserves its own moment here too, because it's been a consistent thread through this whole war. Iranian state media has repeatedly put out footage, including AI-generated and digitally altered material, designed to make it look like Iranian forces are winning engagements that, by every independent account, are going badly for them. That's not a new tactic for authoritarian regimes under military pressure. Keeping your own population believing the war is winnable is often the single most important propaganda job a government under siege has. Because if that belief collapses internally, the regime's survival calculation gets a lot more dangerous a lot faster than any external military pressure alone would. Some of that messaging has found receptive audiences in parts of Western media too, particularly among outlets and commentators generally skeptical of U.S. and Israeli military action in the region, who've amplified framing sympathetic to Tehran's position. That's worth flagging, not because skepticism of military escalation is illegitimate, it's a completely reasonable position to hold, but because there's a difference between principled anti-war skepticism and unknowingly repeating a foreign government's information operation. Worth keeping those two things separate in your own head as you read coverage of this. Now let's talk about where this could go next, because that's the question everyone actually cares about. The most direct signal so far came straight from President Trump in a Fox News interview this week. Asked whether he'd rule out a ground campaign, he didn't rule it out, saying only that he'd consider it if he thought it was appropriate, and adding a line that's since been quoted everywhere. Sometimes you need a ground campaign, but we have other people that will do the ground campaign for us. He didn't name which countries he meant. In that same conversation, he pointed to Kharg Island, which handles something like 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, as a target that's already been struck multiple times, and floated the idea that expanding strikes to bridges and power plants could happen within the week. Reporting since then has added detail. Officials say Trump has specifically been weighing an operation aimed at Kharg Island itself, along with underground facilities at a site believed to be tied to Iran's nuclear program. None of that is locked in. Presidents get shown menus of options constantly that never get ordered. But the fact that this menu exists and is actively being discussed in the Situation Room tells you the appetite for escalation, not de-escalation, is what's currently driving policy. If a ground element does eventually happen, the other people framing matters a lot, because the likely shape isn't American boots kicking down doors in Tehran. It's proxy and partner forces, regional allies, possibly Kurdish or other opposition militias, doing the work of holding territory while the US and coalition partners handle the air picture, the intelligence, and probably the funding and equipment. That's a strategy with real historical precedent and real historical failure modes both. Seize a town, try to hold it as a foothold, try to let resistance expand outward from there with air cover propping it up. It's worked in some places, and it's collapsed messily in others, and which one this becomes would depend heavily on whether any local population is actually willing to rise and hold, versus whether it's foreign fighters trying to occupy hostile ground, which tends to go very differently. There's also a reason Iran hasn't opened a second front by hitting Israel directly right now, and it's not because they don't want to. It's a calculation about consequences. Israel has demonstrated repeatedly over the course of this war that it can locate and remove senior Iranian military leadership on very short notice, and a regime that's already lost its supreme leader and a string of top officials in the opening strike knows exactly what a wider provocation risks triggering. Restraint here reads less like moderation and more like fear of losing what leadership infrastructure is left. Regional diplomacy has been quietly working overtime in the background of all this too, even while the strikes continue. Oman in particular has positioned itself as the primary go-between, hosting the talks that produced the June memorandum and continuing to host meetings between Iranian and Omani officials, even after that memorandum fell apart. Gulf states more broadly appear to have shifted posture over the course of this war, moving from nervous bystanders, hoping the fighting would simply stay out of their waters, toward active pressure on Washington to finish the campaign rather than let it drag on indefinitely at a slow simmer, because a slow simmer is precisely the scenario that keeps their own shipping lanes and oil facilities exposed to sporadic Iranian retaliation without ever resolving the underlying threat. That regional alignment matters more than it might seem from the outside, because a U.S. campaign that the Gulf states themselves are quietly rooting for has a very different political shelf life than one they're trying to talk Washington out of. Let's step outside Iran for a second, because there's a lot else moving in the world right now that's connected to this same broader moment of major powers testing new capabilities and new red lines, and it's worth understanding as a set rather than as isolated stories. The most genuinely historic item this week has nothing to do with Iran directly. On July 15th, over the Mojave Desert, an Anduril-built YFQ-44A Fury drone, flying out of Edwards Air Force Base as part of the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, fired a live AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missile at a simulated target and hit it. This is the first time an American uncrewed combat aircraft has completed an actual weapons launch of this kind. Not a remote-piloted drone with a human at the stick the whole way through, but a semi-autonomous aircraft that located, tracked, and closed on the target largely on its own, with a human operator retaining the final authority to issue the fire command. The Air Force has been explicit that the decision to release a weapon stays with a person, full stop. That's policy, not just a talking point, but the targeting and engagement sequence leading up to that decision was handled by the aircraft itself. It's the kind of test that quietly rewrites what air combat looks like going forward. Cheaper, uncrewed aircraft flying ahead of manned fighters into the most dangerous airspace, multiplying the number of shooters in a fight without multiplying the number of pilots at risk. General Atomics has a competing design in the same program, so this isn't a one-off. It's the leading edge of a real shift in how the Air Force plans to fight. The path to that moment matters too, because it wasn't a leap, it was a fast, deliberate climb. The Fury flew for the first time barely 9 months ago, reaching that milestone in about a year and a half from the start of development, which is an unusually rapid pace for any new military aircraft, let alone one carrying live weapons. Engineers spent the early part of this year running captive carry flights with inert missiles bolted to the airframe just to gather handling data before anyone let it near a real launch. And only after that groundwork was done did the program move to an actual live shot. It's also not happening in a vacuum globally. A comparable Australian-designed drone fighter, Boeing's Ghost Bat, fired its own AMRAAM autonomously against an airborne target back in December, which means multiple air forces are independently racing toward the same basic concept at roughly the same time. Cheap, attritable, uncrewed aircraft that can absorb the risk a human pilot otherwise would. Whichever country gets that concept to full operational maturity first gains a meaningful edge in exactly the kind of contested airspace scenario that a Taiwan contingency, or for that matter, another Gulf crisis 5 years from now, would actually look like. Space gets less attention than fighter jets, but arguably matters just as much right now. This week, the nominee to lead Space Force operations told the Senate Armed Services Committee that China's ability to threaten American satellites is advancing extremely fast, using language about attack chains, already built to track U.S. carrier strike groups from orbit. The numbers behind that warning are stark on their own. China went from roughly 128 satellites in 2015 to close to 200 today, and more than 500 of those are intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms. That's not abstract. If you're operating a carrier strike group in a contested region, and an adversary has built the orbital infrastructure to track that group in near real time, the entire calculus around how safely you can project power changes. It's part of why there's a budget request north of $70 billion on the table for Space Force specifically, because the assumption that space is a peaceful, uncontested domain has been quietly dying for years, and this testimony is just the latest confirmation of that. Ukraine's war against Russia hasn't paused for any of this either, and this week brought one of the more dramatic pieces of footage to come out of that theater in a while, a drone and missile assault on the Russian port at Novorossiysk. Watch the tracer fire in the released video, and you get an honest read on how seriously Russian air defense is taking the threat these attacks pose, because that's not a token response. That's a port trying to fend off a serious incoming raid. Ukraine has increasingly targeted Russian energy and shipping infrastructure over the past year as a way of imposing direct economic cost. And a strike of this scale on a major Black Sea port fits that pattern and extends it. It's also a reminder that even with the Middle East consuming the news cycle, the war in Ukraine hasn't cooled off, it's evolved, and Ukrainian long-range strike capability keeps getting more precise and more ambitious. There's a broader lesson sitting inside that Novorossiysk footage that connects back to everything else in this update. A war that started as a grinding, largely static land conflict along a fixed front line has, over the past couple of years, grown a second, much more mobile axis fought almost entirely with long-range drones and missiles against economic targets far behind the front, refineries, ports, shipping. That's the same basic playbook the US and Iran are running against each other in the Gulf. Degrade the other side's ability to earn and move money rather than only fighting for territory. It's becoming the default grammar of 21st century state conflict. Hit the economy that funds the war machine because a modern military, however large, eventually runs on the same thing every other institution runs on, and that's cash flow. Watching Ukraine and the Gulf simultaneously, you're really watching two different applications of the identical underlying strategy. And then there's Cuba, which genuinely surprised a lot of people this week when it surfaced in the news. Senior Pentagon officials have reportedly reviewed a range of potential military options regarding Cuba, including a scenario built around an Army-led air assault involving thousands of troops from the 101st Airborne Division, the unit specifically trained for that kind of mission. It's important to be precise about what this actually is and isn't, because the framing matters. Multiple officials speaking to reporters have stressed this is early-stage contingency planning, the kind of concept of operations briefing the Pentagon runs routinely, so a president has options on the shelf if circumstances change, not an indication that any operation has been authorized or is imminent. The context behind it is the Trump administration's broader maximum pressure campaign against Havana, restoring Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, tightening financial and travel restrictions, and growing concern over Cuba's deepening relationships with Russia, China, and Iran, along with reports that Cuba has acquired attack drones of unknown origin. The defense secretary has acknowledged presenting options to the president, while also saying the administration would prefer a more constructive relationship going forward. Worth noting, too, that this planning is surfacing at a moment when a huge share of America's most capable offensive assets and attention are already committed to the Iran campaign, which several officials quoted in this reporting flagged as exactly the kind of overstretch problem that makes acting on Cuba anytime soon operationally difficult, even if the political will existed. It's also worth noting what the U.S. intelligence community's own annual threat assessment actually says about Cuba, because it complicates the more alarmist framing you'll see in some coverage. That assessment, published earlier this year, largely treats Cuba as an enabling environment for larger rivals, a place where Russia, China, and Iran can operate and gain proximity to the U.S., rather than as an independent military threat in its own right. It doesn't describe Havana as possessing capabilities that materially threaten the U.S. on its own. That doesn't make the contingency planning meaningless. Militaries plan for low probability scenarios all the time precisely, so the option exists if the underlying picture changes. And officials have specifically flagged Cuba's acquisition of drones of unknown origin as a new wrinkle worth tracking. But there's a real gap between the Pentagon ran a concept of operations briefing and an invasion is coming, and that gap is exactly where a lot of the breathless coverage of this story has chosen to live this week. Step back and look at the whole board for a second, because that's really what all of this adds up to. You've got an active, expanding air war against Iran with a naval blockade, squeezing the regime's finances by roughly $500 million a day, a leadership structure in Tehran that's fractured and possibly playing a deliberate good cop, bad cop game with the outside world, a president who's publicly floated both a wider ground campaign through proxy forces and direct strikes on Iran's most important oil export facility, a drone that just fired a live air-to-air missile for the first time in history, a Space Force warning that China can already track American carriers from orbit, Ukraine hammering Russian port infrastructure with real success, and Pentagon planners quietly sketching out what an operation against Cuba could look like, even while insisting nothing's decided. None of these threads are actually separate stories. They're all symptoms of the same underlying moment, a period where several major powers are simultaneously testing how far new capabilities and old rivalries can be pushed before something breaks in a way nobody can walk back. What happens from here is genuinely uncertain, and anyone who tells you with total confidence exactly how this ends is selling you something. The stated Iranian goal, forcing the closure of the strait to bleed Gulf economies until Washington caves and lifts the blockade on favorable terms, looks close to unachievable given how thoroughly Iran's coastal missile and radar infrastructure has already been degraded. But regimes under this kind of pressure don't need to win outright. Historically, they've often just needed to survive long enough for the political will of a democracy on a 4-year election clock to fracture. And that's a real strategic bet, not a crazy one. It's worked against Western powers before. Whether it works this time depends on things that are genuinely unknowable right now, how much further the regime can fracture internally, whether Gulf states keep pressuring Washington to finish the campaign rather than ease off, whether Iran's remaining missile stockpile can sustain the tempo of these barrages for months more, and whether escalation into a ground element or a strike on Kharg Island actually happens or turns out to be one more item on a list of options that gets shown to a president and then shelved. It's useful, too, to think through the handful of ways this could actually resolve, because the war continues indefinitely isn't really a stable end state for anyone involved. Wars this expensive tend to bend toward one of a few recognizable shapes eventually. One path looks like slow attrition toward a negotiated settlement, where the blockade and the strikes keep degrading Iran's military and financial capacity, until whatever leadership remains in Tehran concludes that a deal on worse terms than the collapsed June memorandum is still better than continuing to bleed. And that's arguably the most historically common outcome for a war between a materially overmatched regional power and a coalition with total air superiority. A second path is the one hinted at in Trump's own comments this week, a deliberate escalation aimed at seizing or neutralizing a handful of high-value targets, Kharg Island chief among them, that would cripple Iran's remaining oil revenue entirely and could be framed domestically as a decisive, relatively contained operation rather than an open-ended ground war. A third, messier path is the one nobody in Washington is eager to say out loud, a scenario where continued fracturing inside the Iranian leadership produces either a genuine internal collapse or, alternatively, a more radicalized and less predictable rump government that has less to lose, and therefore less reason for restraint, including on the question of whether to finally strike Israel directly. None of these paths is foreclosed right now. Which one we end up on likely gets decided less by any single battle and more by how much longer Iran's stockpiles, its economy, and its internal cohesion can absorb the current tempo of pressure before something gives. What is certain is that nothing about the last 5 months suggests either side is close to backing down on its own terms, and the range of items now sitting on the table, from carrier tracking satellites to autonomous fighter drones to contingency plans for an island 90 miles from Florida, tells you this moment is bigger than any single flashpoint. It's a genuine stress test, a live one, of just about every assumption the post-Cold War world order has been quietly running on for the better part of 3 decades, and it's playing out in real time, in several theaters at once, on several continents at once, with no single headline big enough to capture the whole picture on its own. That's why it's worth checking back in regularly rather than waiting for one clean resolution, because a story moving this fast, on this many fronts, rarely gives you a tidy ending. It just gives you the next update. And given the pace of the last 5 days alone, that next update probably isn't far off, so treat everything above as a snapshot of a moving target, rather than a final word on any of it. That's where things stand as of July 19th. Stay with reliable primary reporting as this develops, because a story with this many moving parts, this much strategic messaging from multiple governments, and this much financial incentive wrapped around the content covering it, is exactly the kind of story where it pays to double-check any specific claim against more than one credible source before you accept it as settled fact.